Hey, it's Jake. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're in bed and I'm going to read you a story from Christmas Crimes at the Mysterious Bookshop. This is a compilation of short stories edited by Otto Penzler, the owner of the Mysterious Bookshop in New York City. Every year, as a gift to his customers, he commissions a mystery author to write a story. There are 3 requirements. There must be a mystery, it needs to be set during the Christmas season, and at least some of the action needs to take place in the Mysterious Bookshop. The added requirement of this one is that there needs to be a crime. The short story that I'll be reading to you today, I read last night and I quite enjoyed it, so I figured I would read this to you this evening. Grab some popcorn or a cup of tea and enjoy the story. This is The Gift of the Wiseguy by Rob Hart. Eric Calabrese stood at the back of the Mysterious Bookshop, surveying the crowd that was nearly spilling out the door and onto the sidewalk. Snow fell in lazy circles outside the tall windows, and the space was permeated by the smell of his grandmother's lasagna. She died years ago, but his sister Christine resurrected the recipe. She made 5 trays. Eric thought it was a bit much, but that's Italian hospitality. There's not enough food unless there's too much food. He'd brought Tupperware containers so people could bring home leftovers, a scenario growing less likely every time the heavy doors swung open and a burst of cold air whipped through the store. He'd been warned continuously by his agent, by his publisher, by his writing pals, that book release parties were exercises in frustration, especially for a first book. Even more especially during the holidays with so many people out of town, that he might see a couple of friends, maybe a few stragglers off the street, but that's it. But then the New York Times review hit. The writer called his book thoughtful and precise and heart-rending. Suddenly it was everywhere. NY1, the Daily News, and the Post covered it. BuzzFeed shot a short video in which a writer for the site, who looked like he was playing dress-up as a lumberjack, raved about it. Tomorrow morning, he had to be in Times Square at 6 a.m. for Good Morning America. The plastic cup of red wine in his hand, the first of the night, would also be the last. No sense in being hungover for that. Someone broke through the crowd and approached the spot Eric had staked out by the coat rack. It was Ian, the lanky bookstore manager. "You ready to get started?" Ian asked. "Sure," Eric said. "What's the plan?" "I'll do a quick introduction and then you can have the floor." Otto isn't a big fan of authors reading from their books. Usually we just do discussion and questions, but with a crowd like this, he gestured at the packed room, you can pretty much do whatever you want. "Could I have a minute?" "Sure," Ian said. "Just give me a wave." Eric finished the last sip of his wine and set the cup on a shelf heavy with Sherlock Holmes books. He ducked into the back room, and then the bathroom, shutting the door and locking it behind him. He put down the toilet seat and sat, running his fingers over the glossy cover of his book. White Sheep, Growing Up in the Calabrese Family. There were 100 more copies in the store after the Times review. Ian said he upped the order. This was one of the first off the press, filled up with sticky notes, marking off passages Eric thought might be good for live readings. He wasn't thrilled about a discussion, because there wasn't much about this that he wanted to discuss. Everything he wanted to say about his childhood was in black and white between his hands. Writing about it had excised it, and it felt perverse to dwell. Eric looked at himself on the cover of the book. The photo the designer chose was in color but faded. He was standing in front of the Wonder Wheel in Coney Island. His mother, short and pear-shaped, with big eyes and a stern smile, had her arm draped over his shoulder. Next to them was his father, holding Christine, wrapped in a swaddling blanket. She was only 6 months old. He hated the photo. He was chubby and his ears stuck out. He was wearing that god-awful Star Wars t-shirt, which had been black once, but had stretched and faded to gray. His white tube socks came up to his knobby knees. Worse than that, his father was in it. But his publisher, Jason, insisted. The story was about them, and the photo lent it an air of verisimilitude. That's the word Jason used. It meant honesty. Eric was pretty sure Jason was trying to bury the debate under a $10 word. It worked. He handed over the photo, and here it was, staring back at him like a bad memory that keeps a person up at night. When Eric could put aside the weight of it pressing against his chest, when he could separate the memory of his dad disappearing from their lives only a few months after it was taken, he had to acknowledge it did look pretty nice on the cover of the book. Eric wondered what his father looked like now, 20 years later. Wondered if he was alive. He was a stout man, thick in the shoulders, but in a healthy way. He played football in college and looked like he could still hold his own in a pickup game. Dark, curly hair that got passed to Christine, whereas Eric inherited his mother's light and fair complexion. There was a knock at the door. Eric got up and flushed the toilet so whoever was outside wouldn't wonder why he was just sitting around in the bathroom. He opened the door and stepped into the back room. Straight into his father. Eric Calabrese. Eric drew in a breath, held it, found he couldn't let it out. He nearly dropped the book, but caught himself. He knew it immediately. Those pale blue eyes, the dark hair gone gray but still curling in ringlets around his ears, except he looked so different, like the air had been let out of his body, a Thanksgiving Day balloon at the end of the route, caving in on itself. "Hello, Eric," his father said, his voice weak but still reverberating the way it did, so you could always tell where he was in a room. He was wearing a tan coat, a red scarf, and black leather gloves. His face, freshly shaved. Impeccably put together, always, and all these years later. "Dad?" His father smiled. The smile stretched his face into something akin to a grimace. Eric's first instinct was to ball up his fist, throw it into his father's face. He took a deep breath, reminded himself that he was not like his father. "What are you doing here?" he asked, lowering his voice. "My boy writes a book," he says. "I wanted to wish you well." Eric felt his temperature and pulse rising in tandem. "So you just show up? You're in witness protection. You can't do that." "It's too late now, isn't it?" he said with another smile, showing a little more strength. "How have you been, kiddo?" "Don't do that," Eric said, stepping back toward the bathroom door, wanting there to be space between them, which was difficult in the back room, full of books and shelves that had been pushed off the floor to make room up front. "You missed so much of my life. You missed Mom's funeral." The smile disappeared. "She wouldn't have wanted me there. We would have wanted you there. Just some kind of acknowledgement that you even cared." "I do care," his father said. "I care very much. There are still people in this town that want me dead. You think I do this lightly?" Eric started to say something, but stopped himself. What was there to say that could sum up 20 years and every conceivable emotion? Except, "You shouldn't have come. Come on, I know I've made a lot of mistakes," his father said. "And I have to admit, I was a little upset when I first read the book. There's a lot of dirt in there, but it's mostly all correct." "You read it already?" Eric asked. "It just came out today." "I used to run this town, kid. You think I can't get an advanced copy of the book, even all the way out in Arizona?" The thought of his father in the desert almost made Eric laugh. Before witness protection, his father never left New York, barely left Brooklyn. "So, that's where they put you?" "Scottsdale," his father said. "All they know about Italian food is Olive Garden. It's tragic. I tried the lasagna up front. I know my mother's lasagna. Did you do that?" "Christine." His face lit up. "Is she here?" "I think you should go." "I just got here. Let me see her. See how she turned out." "She turned out great, no thanks to you," Eric said. "I think we both turned out pretty damn good considering you disappeared. You gave up on this family a long time ago. I'm the one who provided for Mom and Christine." "Hey," his father said, his voice snapping. "How about a little gratitude, huh? You still found a way to profit off it." Eric felt himself grow flush. Wondered if he should hold back, but decided he shouldn't. His greatest strength was his words, so he aimed them at his father like a barrage of bullets. "I would trade everything this book has brought me if it meant you stayed." Instead, you ratted out a bunch of guys and ran and hid like a coward. You gave us nothing. You left us nothing. All we have is your absence. I figured out a way to make it provide for me and Christine. That's what this book is. You leaving was the only gift you ever gave us." "Eric," his father said, stepping forward, his eyes misting. "Please, it's Christmas, and I'm trying. Doesn't that mean something?" Eric turned and looked away, not wanting his father to see him cry, remembering what happened the last time when his fourth-grade teacher died suddenly, a sharp, disappointed admonishment that it's not what real men do. After a few moments of silence, his father said, "I was not a good father, but I loved you and your sister and your mother. I want you to know that. For whatever it means to you, even if it means nothing, the things I did them because I was protecting you. That was always the most important thing." A pause. "I love you, Eric. Best of luck with the book, okay?" Eric heard the sound of footsteps and the door creaking open. He turned and found he was alone in the small space, the door swinging closed. Officer Rebecca Botti grasped the heavy-duty headphones and pulled them off her ears. They were digging into her head and she needed a little relief. Not that she needed to wear them. She could barely hear over the din coming from inside the bookstore. It sounded like waves crashing into a rocky shore. But she liked to listen. It was good to be thorough. There wasn't much else to do besides try and find a comfortable position in the ancient office chair arrived here from points unknown. The NYPD surveillance van wasn't pleasant, and it didn't smell good. The outside was branded with the logo of the Fulton Fish Market, and she idly wondered if that was a cover or if that's where the department bought it from. The brackish smell seemed to confirm her suspicion, but that could also be years of accumulated sweat and takeout. She turned to her right to Detective Seth Tanner, spilling out of his own office chair, peering at the hodgepodge of monitors, his face cast blue in the flickering light. The setup looked like someone raided a Radio Shack that was going out of business. She looked up at the mugshot of Manetto Manny Calabrese, taped to the wall of the van. "You sure it was him?" she asked Tanner. "I think so," Tanner said, not looking away from the monitor. "No one's seen the guy in 2 decades, but I think it was him. Lost some weight, but same hair, same gait." Tanner looked down at the keyboard like it was alien technology. "I don't even know where to start with this. Can you play it back?" Botti slid her chair across the cramped space to the keyboard, tapped the hotkeys that would rewind and then replay the video. She watched as a hunched figure strode past the camera and turned into the bookstore. To her eyes, it was a blur, but Tanner seemed convinced because he was smiling, and Tanner was not a guy who smiled. "If this is him, it's a pretty big deal, right?" Botti asked, her breath pluming in front of her. Tanner reached down and clicked on the space heater by his feet. Within moments, it would smell like a bundle of hair caught fire, but that would be enough to bring the temperature up to a more comfortable level. "If it's him," Tanner said. Botti looked down at the space heater. "Are you sure that thing is safe to be using in here?" "Not really, no," Tanner said. Botti picked up her headphones again, placing them carefully over her ears. Same sounds, waves crashing. She thought she could pick out a word here or there, but it'd all be useless until the tech people cleaned it up, which might not even be necessary. She took the headphones off again. "What do we even do?" Botti asked. "The feds have had him in witness protection. There's no active warrant on him. He's just a guy now. I don't mean to speak out of turn, sir, but why are we here?" "First," Tanner said, "he's not just a man, he's a monster. 3 confirmed kills and 2 more suspected, plus all the lives he ruined. And what? He gets to skate because he dimed somebody out? It's a miscarriage of justice." "Right, but we're not going after him just to go after him." Botti looked at Tanner and raised an eyebrow. "Are we?" The scorched smell from the heater was overwhelming. Tanner noticed too. He reached down and clicked it off, the red glow of the coils fading. "He killed my partner," Tanner said. Botti paused. That was a violation not to be taken lightly. "If you have new evidence," Botti started. Tanner put his hand up. I'm the detective, you're the officer, let's do the job, and then we can go home, okay? Bati nodded, put the headphones back on her head. But she couldn't ignore the feeling that was prodding her. Because the more she thought about it, the more she had to question the circumstances that evening. As a member of the intelligence division, she'd done 6 stakeouts, and all 6 included a lot of planning, as well as a bit of paperwork to sign out the van and the equipment. Tonight was different. Tanner approached her at her desk. He asked for her help on a special assignment. The van was parked around the street from the precinct, not in the depot. She went along because Tanner had been on the job since before she was born, and she had no reason to doubt him. But something wasn't adding up. Sir, Bati asked, I don't mean to be difficult, but is this official NYPD business? Tanner finally looked away from the screen, held her gaze. His face was all sharp angles and deep shadows, the way the light from the monitors flickered across it. When he spoke, he said, I can make your life in the department a lot harder. You're free to go, file a complaint about me, whatever. But then you're inviting that upon yourself. Or let's just sit here a little while longer and we can go home. Deal? Bati held his gaze. She knew that sometimes rules needed to be bent in the course of doing the right thing, but only as a last resort, only as long as the rule would snap back into place unbroken and intact. That kind of thing she could live with. But this was too much. This was the kind of thing that could result in a major reprimand, if not getting kicked off the force entirely. She was about to push again when there was a knock on the side of the van. Holy, Tanner said. What? She asked. It's him. She leaned over in her seat and saw Calabrese looking into the pinhole camera next to the door, his features fish-eyed by the lens, but it was clear that he was smiling. Tanner ran his hand down his pant leg to make sure his ankle holster was in place. He hated wearing his regular holster on stakeouts since he spent most of the time hunched over and it dug into his ribs. After he confirmed everything was where it should be, the door slid open. Most days the memory burned a small hole in his gut, but seeing Calabrese standing there, it hit him full force. Reggie Sachs, bleeding out from a bullet to the throat on a filthy warehouse floor, pleading with Tanner, but nothing coming out of his mouth but blood and wet gurgles. Tanner didn't see Calabrese pull the trigger, didn't even see him at the scene, but they'd been following him for weeks trying to put together enough evidence for a RICO case that would cripple the Calabrese family. Instead, Tanner wandered off to take a leak and came back to find the life leaking out of Reggie, whose last word he croaked out before coughing up a river of blood and dying. Manny. Manny Calabrese. It was all Tanner needed to know. And here was Calabrese standing there with a smile on his face. Tanner's hand shook. He wanted more than anything to pull his gun and give Calabrese a taste of what he did to Reggie. He gripped his face, fingers digging into the bone until it hurt. Calabrese was holding 2 Tupperware containers, flecks of snow, layering on the shoulders of his tan coat. He looked over at Bati, then above her head at the mugshot. He nodded toward it. You might be surprised, but that handsome fella up there is me. That photo was taken a long time ago, obviously. Tanner tried to speak, but found rage blocking his throat. Calabrese nodded to Bati and said, Darling, your partner and I have some things to discuss. Why don't you head on inside, huh? Get yourself a slice of lasagna. Probably the best lasagna you'll ever have. Bati looked at Tanner. Tanner could see it in her eyes. She was worried that if she left, something bad would happen, and she was right. But he still outranked her, and at this point, it didn't matter. Best she not be around to see this. Go ahead, Tanner said. But now, Bati exhaled, hung her headphones from the hook next to the monitors, climbed out of the van, careful to give Calabrese a wide berth, and headed across the street to the bookshop. Calabrese climbed into the van, pulled the door shut, and put the Tupperware containers on the makeshift desk under the monitors. He eased himself into the battered office chair that Bati had just occupied. Tanner's heart slammed against the inside of his chest. The last time he saw this man, he was 30 pounds lighter, still had all of his hair, could read small text without squinting. It felt like a lifetime. Calabrese, too, looked so different. like he was slowly disappearing. Calabrese slid the chair forward, the wheels creaking and grunting with the exertion, so he could reach past Tanner and turn on the space heater. It crackled and roared to life. "There, that's better," Calabrese said. "So how are things?" "Don't you dare. I didn't kill your partner, you know," he said. "Sachs, right? He was a good cop, believe it or not. I respect cops. You do your job, I do mine. It just so happens they run in conflict with each other. I'd never kill a good cop." Tanner reached down to his ankle, removed the black Ruger LCR, and placed it in his lap. Not so much as a threat, but to set the tone of the proceedings. Calabrese shook his head. "I bring you a peace offering," he said. "My mother's lasagna, best in the world. It's 4 days before Christmas, no less, and this is how you respond." "Say your piece," Tanner said, "because you've got about 2 minutes before I paint the inside of this van with your brain." Calabrese sighed. "I get it. I would be angry too. But you have to understand what happened that day. He said your name." "I'm sure he did. I was there." Tanner gripped the gun. "Here's how it went down," Calabrese said, leaning forward. "I was at the warehouse following up on a thing, and I run into this guy. You remember Lou Rossi? The man was a thug, an animal. He was cheating on the family, you know what I mean? So I run into him doing something he shouldn't be doing, and he gets the drop on me. He's holding me at gunpoint." Calabrese extended his index finger, thumb pointed up, imitating a gun. "And Sack comes wandering in." He swung his hand in a wide arc and cocked his thumb. And bang! Rossi shoots Sachs in the throat. I don't even think Rossi knew what he was doing. He was just startled is all. "And you just left Reggie there to die," Tanner said. "I heard you coming. You're not exactly light on your feet, not even then. What was I going to do besides get blamed for it?" "Then why did he say your name?" Tanner asked. "It was the last thing he said before he died." "How should I know?" Calabrese said, shrugging. "Maybe he was saying, 'Then he didn't do it, you dim bulb.' All I know is Rossi's gun killed your partner, not mine." "Right, and where's Rossi? Let's see if he can corroborate." Calabrese shook his head. "That's not going to happen, unless you've got a medium on staff or a Ouija board or something." Tanner sat back in his chair. It groaned under his weight. The thought of revenge was the only thing that sustained him, the promise of a period on the end of the sentence that had been running on for the past 20 years. All he had left was an empty apartment in Queens, a few plants, and a futon. The best he could do with the alimony payments, the child support payments, the penalties he paid for a life that had become consumed by his hunt for Calabrese. And now it had been taken from him. No, it couldn't be true. Calabrese was trying to save himself, that's all. "I don't believe you," Tanner said. "I wish you did. Not that it matters. You want to kill me right now, go ahead. You're only moving up the deadline a bit." "What do you mean?" Calabrese sighed, placed a hand on his stomach. "Pancreatic cancer," he said. "Thing about the pancreas is, it's all the way in the back of your abdomen, out of sight. Most times when the doctors find it, it's already too late. I'm on stage 4. There's no stage 5. I got a few months left, maybe." The news cast Calabrese in a different light. His face didn't look thin, it looked sunken. He didn't look tired, he looked weak. "What am I supposed to do?" Tanner asked. "Feel sorry for you? Even if what you said is true, you're still a killer. You ruined lives for your own personal gain." "No, I did it because—" Calabrese stopped. Thought about it, shook his head. "I'm not here for a philosophical discussion. I was pretty sure this had been eating at you, and I wanted to put it to rest, even if not for you, for me. Now, here." Calabrese took the 2 Tupperware containers off the desk and held them. "I know we're not pals," he said, "but it's Christmas. Let's put all that hate and regret behind us. Sit here and just enjoy one last meal together. Then you can do whatever the hell you want to me, okay?" Tanner breathed deep. Then he reached over and clicked off the transmitter that was recording everything going on in the store, along with the conversation they were having. Calabrese seemed to get that this was not an insignificant gesture. A look of fear flashed across his face. "I hate you wise guys so much," Tanner said. "Stuff like The Sopranos, The Godfather, all these movies and television shows that take the horrible stuff you do and glorify it. I bust my hump for going on 30 years trying to make the world a better place, and kids got stars in their eyes for Michael Corleone like he's a hero or something." Tanner slid his chair forward until he was closer to Calabrese, until he could smell the man's wool jacket. His breath. "Here's the truth," Tanner said. "Your entire family is a blight. After I'm done with you, I'm coming for your kids. The two of them were raised of dead men. Right now, your son is in there profiting off your legacy. It's obscene. Pretty soon he's going to find himself in a pair of cuffs. I'll find a way. And once I do that, I'm going to take the son of Sam Law and swing it at him like a bat. I will make sure he never sees one more red cent from that book." Calabrese frowned. "I've done some bad things, but I've never threatened a man's family. Never." "You made your bed." Calabrese's nostrils flared. The scorched smell of the space heater filled the small space. "A threat like that would not have worked out well for you back in the day," Calabrese said. "Times have changed. I'm willing to set all this aside. I will do whatever you want, just leave my family out of it." Calabrese's gaze softened. He added, "Please?" Tanner shook his head. No, I can't do that." He almost said, "I'm sorry," but caught himself before the words left his mouth. This man didn't deserve his sympathy. Calabrese looked down at his hands, at the blue Tupperware containers. He considered them for a moment before handing the one in his left hand to Tanner. "I'll tell you what," he said. "Let's just eat. Pretend for a few seconds like we're two men whose lives haven't been ruined by the mistakes we've made. Then you can do whatever the hell you want to me. Right here, right now. Shoot me in the head, beat me to death, I don't care. My son." A tear formed in the corner of his eye. "He didn't even want me here. He told me to leave. You can't hurt me by hurting him, not anymore." His voice dropped and cracked. "I've punished him and his sister enough." "Fine," Tanner said, snatching the Tupperware container out of Calabrese's hand. "If it'll shut you up." He popped the cover and picked up a plastic fork sitting on the desk, speared a bite, and shoved it in his mouth. Not that he wanted to accept the gift, but there was no sense in letting it go to waste, and anyway, he hadn't eaten since breakfast. If this was the formality that'd buy them some private time together, so be it. He could drive the van down to a quiet spot in Brooklyn, really go to town, work out all those years of frustration. He was pretty sure he saw a hammer next to the driver's seat. The lasagna was delicious, and still warm too. It exploded in his mouth, a far cry from the cold, congealed pizza and Chinese food that filled his refrigerator lately. Calabrese nodded and opened his own container, produced a plastic fork from his coat, and began to eat. "Merry Christmas, by the way," Calabrese said, before taking a bite. Tanner mumbled, his mouth full of food. They finished at the same time, placing the blue plastic containers on the desk. Calabrese wiped his mouth as Tanner swallowed and went to pick up the gun. It slipped from his hand and tumbled to the floor. For a moment he thought his hands were just a little cold, but then realized he couldn't make his fingers curl. "Well, that's enough of that," Calabrese said, climbing out of his seat and reaching for the door of the van. Tanner tried to reach for him, but found his arms didn't want to obey them. Tanner tried to reach for him, but found his arms didn't want to obey him either. They hung from his sides like lumps of dead meat. He tried to speak, but only managed to produce a raspy gurgle as a crooked hand wrapped around his heart and squeezed hard. Calabrese opened the door and stepped down to the street. "For the record," Calabrese said, "I gave you the slice I was going to eat. Figured you'd get your closure and I'd get mine. But then you had to go and threaten my family. That's low. So, here we find ourselves. I know I said I don't kill good cops, but you're not a good cop." Tanner heaved himself forward and tried to stand, One last desperate attempt to get Calabrese before he died. But his feet buckled under him, and he tumbled forward, his face smashing into the floor of the van. The door slid closed with a thump, and he watched as the flickering glow of the surveillance monitors faded into blackness. Eric exited the bathroom to find Ian standing in the back room, wearing a concerned look. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I thought we lost you." The truth was, Eric needed some time for the swelling around his eyes to go down, so it wouldn't be so obvious he was crying. But he didn't want to say that. He settled on, "I'm sorry, I just needed a few minutes." "No worries," Ian said, "but we should get going." Eric followed Ian into the main part of the store, the space filled with people standing shoulder to shoulder. "If I could have your attention, everyone," Ian yelled. Conversations were abandoned as everyone turned. "We're very excited to welcome Eric Calabrese, the author of White Sheep. We don't do a lot of memoir here, but it's a great book, and we're happy to have him. Eric is going to talk a little bit about it and maybe take some questions. Without further ado." Ian gestured to Eric as the room erupted in applause. When it died down, Eric said, "Actually, I want to read a bit." He thumbed open the book, skipping past the sticky notes, to a passage he didn't intend to read, but felt right given the circumstances. "The truth is, my father—" "We can't hear you!" It was his sister Christine calling from the front of the store. He smiled, climbed on a chair so he could get a good look at everyone, including Christine, who was throwing a thumbs up, and began to read again. "The truth is, my father was a complicated man. The hands that strangled the life out of Vincent Abruzzo on October 16th, 1985, are the same hands that played catch with me in the yard of our home in Gravesend. The hands that beat Michael Moretti to death on June 5th, 1987, are the same hands that cradled my sister when she woke up crying in the middle of the night. I have spent my entire life trying to process this. It's left me wondering if I'm tainted, if the kind of evil that afflicted my father was genetic, or if it could be passed down to us, or if we had the freedom to make our own choices to move past it. I choose to believe the latter, but live in fear of the former. There is one truth, though, in all of this, and it's that my father did not think of himself as an evil. Not good, maybe. I think he was smart enough to know the consequences of his actions and how they reflected on the world around him, but everything he did was to provide a good life for myself and my sister. And until he disappeared, after testimony in open court 20 years prior to the publication of this book forced him into witness protection, he did. We never wanted for anything. He never raised a hand to us. If we fell, he picked us up." Eric felt his throat growing thick. He paused and looked up. Standing outside the store, his hand pressed against the glass, was his father. The words on the page grew blurry and Eric swallowed, did his best to recover quickly, lest anyone look back. Because despite the gulf between them, he was afraid someone might see him and didn't want his presence to get him in trouble. Eric smiled and nodded and hoped his father noticed. Manny wished he could go back into the store, but knew that wasn't an option. He met eyes with his son, who smiled and nodded before going back to reading. That would have to be enough. Footsteps crunched in the snow to his left. He turned and saw the pretty young police officer who had been in the van. She was holding aloft a steaming cup of bodega coffee. "Hi," she said. "Hi," Manny said back. "Well, this is awkward," she said with a half smile. Manny figured Tanner could use another couple of minutes to stew. "Listen, Detective Tanner said if I saw you to ask you to get him a cup of coffee," he said. "I see you've already got one, and I'm sorry if it's an inconvenience." A look of relief washed over her face, like she was happy to be getting away from him. "Oh, I don't mind." She offered another smile and turned. "Hey," he called after her. She looked over her shoulder. "You seem like a bright kid," he told her. "Tanner is not a nice man. I know, I'm not one to judge, but you should know that, all right?" She paused like she wanted to say something, then nodded and walked off, rounding the corner. Manny looked across the street. There used to be a bar there, the Raccoon Lodge, that had a fireplace in the little alcove at the back. A great spot on a night like this, but the shutter was down. Probably another victim of the real estate market. He took out his cell phone and dialed the only number programmed in it. It rang 3 times before a groggy voice answered. "Hello? Agent Wilkes? Wait, Manny? Why are you calling? Is everything okay?" "Not really. No. Listen, you still living in Staten Island?" "I am, but if there's a problem, I have to contact the local field office in Scottsdale. I'm in Manhattan." "What?" "It's a long story. Any chance you can come out and meet me?" "Is McSorley's still open? Or did the rat developers get that one too?" "It's still open, but we have to get you back before someone sees you." "Doesn't matter now," he says. "Only place I'm going at this point is Central Booking. That's still over at the Tombs?" "Manny, what the hell are you talking about? Why don't you meet me at McSorley's? I'm gonna have one last drink. I'll order you one. You want light or dark?" Silence on the other end of the phone. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. "Don't rush. Drive safe. I'm not going anywhere." Manny hung up the phone and stuck it in his pocket, gave one last look at the bookstore. Eric was still standing on the chair, reading from his book. Manny couldn't make out what he was saying. His daughter Christine was in there somewhere, too. The pair of them, better than he could have hoped, better than he deserved. He turned and headed toward Broadway, where it would be easier to get a cab. The last day hadn't been so pleasant. He'd lost his taste for the cold between the years living in the desert and the thing eating him from the inside out. But as he walked down Warren Street, he found the cold wasn't so bad. The way it is sometimes when it snows and the air is calm, like the flakes are sucking in the chill, pulling it away as they fall to the ground. It made him think of their last Christmas together, before he made the hardest decision of his life, the one that weighed on him so heavily he hadn't slept a good night since. To leave. That morning the kids got up early. The Christmas prior to that, they'd set a rule for Eric: no presents until the sun came up. The second there was a trace of light in the sky, he had bounded into their room and jumped into their bed. Manny went to Christine's room and found her awake, contentedly playing with her fingers like she was waiting for him. He scooped her out of the crib and they made their way down to the tree, where Eric's face lit up like a fireworks display as he tore open the wrapping around his new bike. Christine cooed at the sparkling lights on the tree, not old enough to understand the significance of the holiday. She was so small and so perfect. Calabrese stopped, reached his hand out to the brick wall of an apartment building to steady himself, turned and took one last look at the van. At the last gift he would ever give his children. And he walked on. This has been The Gift of the Wiseguy by Rob Hart, read to you by the one and only Jake Okoa. And that's a wrap on Vlogmas Day 11. Let me know what you thought of the story in the comments below. Mahalo for watching. I hope I've inspired you to read something today, and I'll see you tomorrow. Good night.